This section is food and drink. This is the sign for apple. Now practice the sign for apple. This is the sign for banana. Now practice the sign for banana. This is the sign for beans. Now practice the sign for beans. This is the sign for bread. Now practice the sign for bread. This is the sign for butter. Now practice the sign for butter. This is the sign for cake. Now practice the sign for cake. This is the sign for candy. Now practice the sign for candy. This is the sign for carrot. Now practice the sign for carrot. This is the sign for cereal. Now practice the sign for cereal. This is the sign for cheese. Now practice the sign for cheese. This is the sign for chocolate. Now practice the sign for chocolate. This is the sign for coffee. Now practice the sign for coffee. This is the sign for cookie. Now practice the sign for cookie. This is the sign for corn. Now practice the sign for corn. This is the sign for cracker. Now practice the sign for cracker. This is the sign for doughnut. Now practice the sign for doughnut. This is the sign for egg. Now practice the sign for egg. This is the sign for fish. Now practice the sign for fish. This is the sign for French fries. Now practice the sign for French fries. This is the sign for grapes. Now practice the sign for grapes. This is the sign for gum. Now practice the sign for gum. This is the sign for hamburger. Now practice the sign for hamburger. This is the sign for ice cream. Now practice the sign for ice cream. This is the sign for jello. Now practice the sign for jello. This is the sign for juice. Now practice the sign for juice. This is the sign for meat. Now practice the sign for meat. This is the sign for milk. Now practice the sign for milk. This is the sign for nuts. Now practice the sign for nuts. This is the sign for orange. Now practice the sign for orange. This is the sign for pizza. Now practice the sign for pizza. This is the sign for popcorn. Now practice the sign for popcorn. This is the sign for potato. Now practice the sign for potato. This is the sign for pumpkin. Now practice the sign for pumpkin. This is the sign for salt. Now practice the sign for salt. This is the sign for sandwich. Now practice the sign for sandwich. This is the sign for soda. Now practice the sign for soda. This is the sign for soup. Now practice the sign for soup. This is the sign for spaghetti. Now practice the sign for spaghetti. This is the sign for toast. Now practice the sign for toast. This is the sign for water. Now practice the sign for water.